Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today. This is the first webinar in a four-part series called the State and Territory Energy Office Summer Webinar Series. So welcome to summer as well. I'm going to do a brief introduction of kind of who we are and why we're here, and then I will turn things over to our amazing speakers. So let's get going. So this series, as I mentioned, is the first in a four-part series. It is part of the National Cooling Standards Initiative, which is an initiative of the Center for Energy Poverty and Climate and the Climate Works Foundation. We have with us on this series the National Association of State Energy Officials, who is one of our close partners on the project. The National Cooling Standards Initiative was conceived of initially as an effort to get more states to implement summer shutoff protections to protect vulnerable households during periods of extreme heat. We know that in the winter, there are a lot of very good winter shutoff protections around the country, but in the summer, a lot of states did not have any kind of shutoff protections. And so we wanted to make sure that households would not be shut off from power for non-payment, even during periods of extreme heat. However, that got us thinking, if we're not shutting people off in the winter because it's too cold, and we're not shutting people off in the summer because it's too hot, but those bills are still accruing, what we're doing in effect is creating the situation where low-income households are paying their bill twice a year. In the fall and the spring, they have big bills that have accrued over the last period where they couldn't get shut off, and then all of a sudden they're left with this big burden. And that doesn't leave them better off in the end, which is always our goal. So what we realized is we need to be rethinking the entire framework of how we're handling low-income households and access to energy. And that means not only, changing shutoff protections and making sure that households are protected during periods of extreme weather, but also thinking about bill payment and payment plans, and should there be different rates for different amounts of energy or for different income levels. And also thinking about on the energy efficiency side, making sure that the homes that low-income households are living in are resilient and are well protected, so that during periods of extreme heat and extreme cold, they do not feel the effects of those wide temperature changes. So that's kind of where this all came from, and we've been digging into a bunch of different angles of that conversation of, how should we be managing and supporting households during periods of extreme weather, particularly extreme heat. This session is going to be kind of an introduction where we're going to discuss what we've been finding in terms of laying the groundwork of the data we've been looking at, and then also looking at some examples of states that are doing a really good job of addressing low-income needs when it comes to extreme heat. There are 3 more webinars in this series. I'm not going to get into detail about those now. They're on the screen, and hopefully you've been able to join those. We'll be able to join those when they come up. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mark Wolf, co-director of the Center for Energy Poverty and Climate, to get things going. Take it away, Mark.
Okay, I think this is Mark Wolf. I think Sandy's on the line, and Jasmine and Lena and Cass, as well as Paige and Bridget. So what we'd like to do, I know it's a small group, so we go through the slides, and I think we're basically recording this to make this sort of more widely available. And if everyone's okay, we'll just go ahead. I'm Mark Wolf. I'm the co-director of the Center for Energy Poverty and Climate, along with Cass Lovejoy, who is my colleague helping to run the center. The purpose of the center is to develop models to help states develop programs to help low-income families adapt to rising temperatures. I'd like to go through some of the reasons we've set up the center and what the data is telling us that I think also hopefully be helpful for state and local administrators as they plan their summer cooling programs and strategies to help low-income families adapt to what increasingly is becoming extreme temperatures, at least in some parts of the country right now. Why don't we go to our first slide? Okay. This is a summary of some of the main points that have concerned us as we look at summer temperatures. And I think what we're trying to say increasingly is that access to affordable cooling should be seen as a companion to access to affordable heating. That before, when states ran their energy assistance programs, they could primarily focus on heating. Cooling was not as big an issue, and certainly much less expensive than it is now. Cooling really was just 2 months of the year, July and August, bleeding over a little bit into June. Now we're moving to a period where cooling is not just bleeding into June, it's also bleeding into September. Summer cooling costs, we just released a report. We're estimating they'll be almost 8% higher than last year, going from $661 to $719. Of even more concern, the prices are higher than they were prior to the pandemic, that they're about 15% higher. And the public, as everyone's aware, thinks a lot about what was life like before the pandemic. And so in this case, life is now harder. The cost to cool a house will be more this summer than then. And it's largely being driven that temperatures continue to rise. And there's no reason to think that's going to change between now and in the future. The other issue in terms of affordability, we've been tracking utility arrears for about 4 years now, and they're staying stubbornly high at about $20 billion. What we're concerned about is that 1 out of 6 families are behind. That's not surprising, since more than 1 out of 6 families in the United States are low income, and many of those are clearly poor. They have very few resources. So it's not surprising that this population is struggling to pay their utility bills. Next. This chart just gives you a sense of what the winter has looked like, and prices have been bouncing around somewhat. They were $836 at the end of the recently completed winter heating season. It was down from $951, in part because the cost of natural gas declined considerably. But if you look at it over the 4-year period, they've been staying in that same range. 725 at the beginning of the pandemic, bounced to 852, then 951. Now it's back to 836. For many Americans, this is affordable. These prices they can manage. Energy use is not linear with income. So in other words, as a family's income goes up, the amount of money they spend on energy does not go up at the same rate. In fact, a family making over $100,000 a year might spend about 3% of their income on home energy, as opposed to about 8% for a lower income family. And so when prices go up, if you're only spending 3% of your income on home energy, it might increase to the 3.3%. You might not even notice. Next chart. Gas, next table. This table gives you a sense of the movement of electric prices. They've been going up steadily the last 10 years, about $450 10 years ago to about $719 this summer. And while there are many reasons for the prices to go up, especially by region, one of the main triggers right now, the last 2 years, has been rising temperatures. So families need to spend more on cooling. And I think the piece that we all became aware of in the last few months, September is getting hotter. There are more and more cooling degree days in September, so we decided to add September to the forecast. Next chart. This just gives you a better sense of the difference by region. It's a little bit confusing, I think, because names like West South Central, what is in West South Central? Those are states like Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, Louisiana. But what's more striking is not that the price in those regions is high, it's the increasing price in cooling states. We don't think of East North Central, for example, Wisconsin as needing air conditioning. We don't think of Nebraska as needing air conditioning, but those states now are using it as well. And I think that's the cause of concern is that the programs like the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program are not funded adequately to provide both heating and cooling. Next slide. This chart, I think, hammers home the point that for low-income families, it is different. 19% of very low-income families have no air conditioning at all. And that number declines as income goes up. So at the highest income levels, there are about 7% that have no equipment. Now, that's partly because these are families, I believe, are in places that just don't get cold. I'm sorry, just don't get hot. We've heard stories in Washington State, for example, like 50% of families have air conditioning. That's because traditionally they haven't needed it. But what's more striking is as income goes up, the percent of income households with central air goes up as well. So at the lowest income levels, it's 47% that have central air. And then by the time you get to 60,000, it's now 72%. And at 150,000 or more, it's 79%, basically everyone. So I think what it is that this is also an economic divide type of issue where there's a significant difference in terms of access between lower income households and higher income households. But you don't see that, of course, with heating. Everybody has a heating system. Cooling is different. Next slide. This chart kind of hammers home the point that what do we know about the median income of solar? A family is adopting solar versus not, versus the median income in the United States. What you can see is that the numbers are median income adopters have higher incomes than lower income families. And now that's changing from back in, say, 2010, but it still shows that families that can invest in solar tend to be better off. It's not surprising, but it also shows that lower income families are less able to make these choices. Next slide. This table again highlights the winter heating costs, that they're staying high. What's striking again is that prices have gone up, but they're starting to go down. So for example, cost of natural gas is dropping, the cost of propane has dropped. Where in summer cooling, we're not seeing that. Summer cooling numbers are just going up. And partly because electric prices are not as volatile. They've tended to stay high, even in periods where feeder fuels like natural gas are coming down. You'll see more stabilizing of electric prices rather than this kind of bouncing effect you see in the cost of home heating with natural gas, just because such a large portion of the bill is derived from the wholesale price of the fuel. Next slide. Let's skip this one. This is just a repetition of winter heating costs. This is another interesting slide. The Census Department conducts a survey about every 2 months called the Census Pulse Survey. It was started at the beginning of the pandemic to essentially take the pulse of the nation in terms of how the economy was affecting families. They've continued doing the survey, and for us it's been quite helpful. They've been asking questions, well, have you struggled to pay your energy bill? And one of the default questions of asking a family is, any time in the last year were you unable to pay the full bill, at least one month. And what you see is that on average, about 1 out of 5 families say, yeah, at times we've had trouble paying the bill. But among low-income families, it's almost double that. 38% said they had trouble paying the bill. Households with children, households with color, also had higher than average rates. And again, the households with children, these are all households with children and all households of color, but it's 1 out of 4, which is quite worrisome because so many families are saying that the utility bill is tough to pay. Next slide. Similar to the last one, people don't remember their utility bills, unfortunately. They know what the gasoline prices was. When you say, well, did you have trouble in the last year? They might not remember precisely. So that's why we asked several different types of questions, like, did you feel you kept your home at an unsafe temperature? That's one that gets to, it's just really cold or really hot. Now, again, you see about 18% of the population saying yes. At least once a year, we felt we had to keep it at a temperature that we didn't think was safe. Among low-income families, it's 33, actually almost 34%. That tells you again about the lower income population in the US, that about a third feel that the bill at times is just plain unaffordable. Next slide. I think we skipped that one. I think we already made the point. Let's skip that one. This is what we're very worried about. LIHEAP funding is coming down. When the pandemic hit, Congress provided us with basically double our regular allocation of gave us $8 billion. Last year it dropped to 6, and this year it's back to 4. What that means is that as temperatures are rising, states have fewer resources to help families pay with their cooling bills. The $2 billion reduction has been quite difficult for the states because many wanted to start cooling programs or provide more robust cooling programs, and there just isn't sufficient resources. We've talked to the Hill about it, and we heard back essentially the budget is extremely tight. If they get a 1% increase in the overall budget, that's pretty exciting to them. The problem is that for our program, what that means is we won't get any extra money. Next slide. This one gives you another sense of the trends in households receiving LIHEAP assistance. You can see that the numbers have been moving up, and that's largely because families are increasingly finding the cost of home energy unaffordable. The thing is, when you look at the numbers, you have to say, yeah, it's a lot, especially this summer. And our concern is that families will, in fact, scale back on home energy use in order to be able to pay the bill. Next slide. This slide illustrates what I said earlier. The numbers of families are saying that they're behind on their bills. It's not changing that much. That number has been fairly consistent. About 21 million households for electricity, 14 million for natural gas. The issue more is the amount they owe. That continues to go up. We now think it's about close to 6 billion for natural gas and 14.5 billion for electricity. It's a lot of money for families to pay back. And in the old model, 30 years ago, families would fall behind on their bill in the winter, but then in the summer, they would have time to pay it off. Now, because as soon as winter's over, there's a short gap of maybe 2 or 3 months, and then summer starts up. So our ability to pay back the bill, I think, has decreased, and that's why these numbers are staying high. Next slide. This is a similar illustration to the REERG data. Next slide. And that's it. I think our main point here, and hopefully the takeaway, is that the lower income population is struggling to pay their home energy bills. They don't have the same equipment as middle and upper middle income families. And we need a better strategy to help families stay connected to the grid and to pay their bills than we currently have. And if Congress keeps funding at about $4 billion, then the issue is going to fall to the states. A number of states are beginning to take action. Connecticut, for example, just approved a 50% discount on electric rates for low-income families. Essentially, you say electric rates, you're talking about summer cooling. It makes a big difference, but these are costs that states have not assumed in a comprehensive way in the past. I think that's going to be the question. If Congress is not likely to increase funding for $4 billion, how do we keep low-income families safe, not only in the winter, but also in the summer?
Great, thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
And now we're going to turn it over to Jasmine, I believe, over at NASIO, who's going to give kind of a preview of a report that that NASIO and NEAD have been working on together, and CEBC have been working on together to support residential cooling. And Jasmine, take it away.
Thanks so much, Cass. Yeah, really grateful for Mark for kind of framing the national stage and kind of the bleak realities that a lot of households are facing in reaction to, you know, more extreme temperatures and the need for cooling equipment. It was nice to kind of develop this resource that Cass is mentioning that we'll be diving into in my presentation concurrently with the NEAD teams, and that there are a lot of state energy office interventions that can support the provision of more equitable residential cooling. And there's a lot of forward momentum from a lot of states already, as well as opportunities for growth. And so we'll kind of dive into that here and today. I guess before that, I'm Jasmine. As Cass mentioned, I'm a senior program manager at NASIO, focused on the buildings program. And I think this will be a great recording to disseminate across a lot of our state energy offices that couldn't attend today. I think we were actually made aware of a Cool Roof Rating Council annual meeting that might be pulling away some folks that would normally be super interested in the topic. So hopefully this will reach them as well. All right. So this might be a little hard to see, but it's a graphic of a lot of the states that will end up being highlighted in this publication. And I should mention NASIO's publication is still forthcoming, but should be released within the next month or so, and will be titled Beating the Heat: Recommendations and Considerations for States to Support Cost-Effective Residential Cooling. And it will be highlighting examples spanning California, Oregon, Colorado, Massachusetts, New York, Arizona, Texas, Hawaii, Alabama, Florida. The list goes on of the ones that we've highlighted in this graphic alone, but a lot of the programs being implemented within each of these states, have lessons that can be gleaned for states across the country, even if they don't have programs that are explicitly being highlighted within our resource. The findings of this paper will also be framing this 4-part webinar series, of which you're attending the first. This is, this may be actually the least interesting of them all, since it is kind of a roundup of the findings that'll then inform a lot of these really interesting expert discussions about protecting vulnerable populations from extreme heat, the kind of public health implications, and angle of that. I believe our third session will be a discussion led by a state energy office panel where you'll be able to hear more directly from them about their comprehensive cooling strategies, and that should, be a bit more interesting to hear as a direct perspective. And then we'll be rounding out the discussion with also mention of funding and financing the energy transition, which I'll just touch on lightly today as well. But hopefully this tees up a really great remainder of this webinar series where we'll hear from seasoned experts. So we kind of offer 5 main recommendations for based on existing state and territory energy office programs for their peer state and territory energy offices to consider. Within this paper, we highlight the crucial role of state energy offices in promoting an energy efficiency first approach, which kind of entails tightening building enclosures and addressing pre-existing building structural inadequacies to reduce energy loss from the get-go, and then also ensure proper sizing and design of energy systems and appliance installations, should they, go all electric, and be sized correctly to meet the energy needs. The second broad recommendation is for state energy offices to center consumer protections and affordability in program design. And this ensures that low-income households can access clean energy technologies without facing any initial cost barriers or limited initial cost barriers, as well as protections against future energy burden. Third tenet is to determine how to prioritize households. So nuanced criteria for income qualified and targeted assistance programs will help efficiently allocate limited state and federal resources, thereby generating the most impact. A fourth being strengthening supply chains and workforce, where a skilled workforce and supply chains will help support high quality efficiency measures across the country to ensure that homes are receiving timely and appropriate retrofit solutions. They can result in more increased or more customer satisfaction and therefore uptake. Kind of the idea that, you know, if your neighbors are happy with a repair that they did, they might go ahead and recommend you do the same. And the uptake kind of happens by word of mouth. And then also the ability to just meet future system repair and maintenance needs by having a robust workforce. You know, a lot of these newer technologies may have different repair procedures that a qualified workforce will need to be able to address. And then lastly here, we kind of recommend fostering just more interagency and intergovernmental partnerships. So from the State Energy Office standpoint, just identifying where other agencies or existing programs can be leveraged to optimize resources and expand assistance to vulnerable populations, especially where, you know, program implementation strategies already exist and don't need to be duplicated. So, you know, over the next several years, state energy offices are tasked to oversee billions of federal dollars from both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, in addition to annual appropriations and funding from the federal and state levels. Most state energy offices, as many of you know, are direct recipients of funding for home energy rebates, as well as home electrification rebates, which will provide households with financial incentives to improve residential efficiency and reduce indoor and outdoor air pollution. They're also direct recipients of a lot of workforce funding, which includes the Energy Auditor Training Grant and training for residential energy contractors, which supports the available building energy efficiency workforce. And these investments can, you know, ensure that measures can actually be installed and applied to homes properly sized and maintained and repaired for years to come. And then additional financial incentives coming from these federal sources also take the form of grants, low-cost loans, transferable and direct pay eligible tax credits that specifically help low-income households. And that also comes with the opportunity to stack or braid with existing annual programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program and Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program that Mark alluded to earlier. So, of course, some of state energy offices, I will mention, do administer WAP funding or LIHEAP, but those that don't can consider more robust relationships with the state or community level agencies tasked with delivering these programs. And this might not be, you know, new to any existing state energy office that have had these WAP and LIHEAP programs in place for many years. All right, so the remainder of this presentation will really be diving into some tangible state examples that fit under each of those 5 large categories of recommendations that I presented 2 slides ago. There are a lot of really exciting approaches happening across a lot of states, and so we'll kind of walk through these and hope that they spark some interest and folks can feel welcome to dive in, especially if you are with a state energy office trying to wrap your mind around some of these fairly broad recommendations. So the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources is operating a low and moderate income housing decarb grant program, but it does exemplify an efficiency first approach by funding heat pump and solar panel installations only alongside insulation, roof repairs, electrical updates, and envelope improvements. So it's kind of treating those efficiency measures as well as the electrification measures as like a hand-in-hand approach. Another example is NYSERDA's Empower Plus program. which provides low and moderate income households with free comprehensive home energy assessments from state-approved contractors. And only after completing the assessment can contractors recommend appropriate equipment upgrades and like sequence kind of a prioritized list of efficiency improvements. And so NYSERDA, in a sense, is kind of positioning itself also as prioritizing efficiency alongside any electrification measure. And then, of course, various weatherization initiatives exist across states, and the states situated in warmer climate zones typically offer some funding for eligible measures, including upgrades of existing residential cooling or installing upgraded systems. The report specifically points to examples from both Alabama and Florida, both states that really experience very warm summers, where in Florida, the funding is distributed to community action agencies for distribution among eligible homes, and the eligible weatherization measures include air filtration, attic insulation, which is a really important measure to minimize cooling loss through certain surfaces in the home, and solar screens, solar reflective coating, and even some cooling unit replacement. And then, of course, the aggregate of funding and programs from the, sorry, skipped ahead here. The aggregate of funding from DOE, from HUD, from FEMA, also funding from, investor-owned and municipal utilities and states, they all offer really significant resources to support efficiency measures that will enable the optimized performance of new and existing cooling systems. So there's just a lot out there supporting efficiency measures that all tie into efficient electrification. And then moving on to the second bucket of recommendations, consumer protections and affordability. Some state energy office examples include the program out of DC, where in collaboration with the DC Sustainable Energy Utility, the DC Department of Energy and Environment offers an emergency HVAC program, and this helps repair and replace broken heating and air conditioning systems for eligible households in the district. In some US homes, energy efficiency or energy efficient like heat pumps could be cost effective over their lifetime of use. But the current market price and installation costs of this equipment could pose pretty significant barriers to low-income households and make it an unrealistic option. So with low-income households, it might be an intervention to look at an intermediate solution of just offering AC systems that are within reason of publicly funded programs, and then just installing them as emergency measures to prioritize public health. And then in New York State, kind of like on a macro level, there is the Energy Affordability Guarantee, which is an element of the Empower Plus program that was previously mentioned, where program participants are guaranteed to not pay more than 6% of their total household income on energy bills by participating within the program. So it's kind of a measure to protect against any future energy burdens coming from installations of new HVAC systems. Within Washington State, there's the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which requires utilities to offer payment assistance to low-income households and demonstrate a reduction in energy burden while doing so. So there's kind of that element of ratepayer assistance and utility involvement. And then from the Hawaii State Energy Office side, there's a program called the Energy Wayfinders, which is a program to share information and opportunities for energy conservation and clean energy adoption that engages schools, community organizations, and households to also kind of navigate all of these various, annual appropriated programs, new programs from the state through federal appropriations or through new federal programs. So, their print format, program materials and grassroots outreach to just help people, help households and the layperson compartmentalize with like all the various assistance available to them. And then I also mentioned here utility shutoff moratoriums. This is fairly relevant for the state energy offices that might be situated within the Public Utility Commission in the state as well. So an example is the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, which is also the Jersey State Energy Office that ratified a decision to lower the minimum threshold temperature from 95 degrees to 90 degrees for their utility shutoff moratorium to go into effect. These moratoriums exist across 18 states where essentially utilities are prohibited from shutting off energy service in certain warm temperatures. Usually that threshold is 90 to 95 degrees, although the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, defines extreme heat as any period of at least 2 days of high heat with temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So, states could consider more actions to lower that threshold from 95 to 90 or even lower. And then in the bucket of determining how to prioritize households, a lot of states have taken on the large task of kind of scoping the needs across their states, of developing comprehensive action plans to build community and household level resilience. I point to, on this slide, the California Governor's Office report on protecting Californians from extreme heat. This was published in April of 2022 and acknowledges the disproportionate consequences of extreme heat events for vulnerable populations. It takes stock of existing extreme heat response efforts across state agencies and then develops a set of robust recommendations for future actions as well. The Oregon State Legislature took a similar approach in passing Senate Bill 1536 in response to deadly heat waves in 2021, which directed the Oregon Department of Energy, or the State Energy Office, to conduct a cooling needs study across publicly supported housing, which included also some manufactured housing and recreational vehicles used as housing. And then also looked at the feasibility for broadly deploying heat pumps in some of these hard to reach housing types. And then lastly, New York, I think, is the poster child of defining, identifying, and targeting disadvantaged communities, and actually predated the Federal Justice 40 program in its Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019 that required New York State to identify disadvantaged communities through a very robust and technical mapping process, and then also ensure that 40% of the benefits of spending on clean energy reached these communities. So in all these states, there is a very concerted effort to identify households and then prioritize them for program reach. And then states can also take several approaches to strengthening workforce and supply chains. One example that we point to in the paper is the the California Air Source Heat Pump Manufacturer Council, which is a state and industry partnership aimed at meeting state heat pump installation targets. It included 10 signatories that were manufacturers, distributors, and suppliers that were committed to meeting California's heat pump installation goal of 6 million by 2030. And so these public and private MOUs are a best practice for just ensuring equipment and workforce availability to then meet lofty or ambitious state energy office or statewide equipment goals and equipment installation goals. And then, I also put in here the publications that NASIO has put out about energy sector workforce diversity and realizing the workforce potential of infrastructure investments, where state energy offices who are interested in recommendations for strengthening a clean energy workforce may refer to the various examples that we highlight throughout these existing publications, which include just more efforts to recruit new clean energy workforce entrants, as well as supporting incumbents in their work through professional development opportunities. And then lastly, in our bucket of 5 recommendations, we suggest, fostering interagency and intergovernmental partnerships. I had already made the point about how state energy offices, if they don't house the LIHEAP and WAP programs, can greater coordinate with the state entities that do. And then there are also, interesting state level examples of this work that's ongoing to address extreme heat mitigation. Most notably and most recently, the Arizona Governor's Office of Resiliency released their 2024 Extreme Heat Preparedness Plan. And this was developed in reaction to an executive order signed by Governor Katie Hobbs during August 2023 that directed agencies across the state to advance a coordinated statewide heat response. And it included action items for the Office of Resiliency, as well as the Department of Administration, Department of Economic Security, Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, Health Services, Public Safety, and essentially implied that there were, a lot of cross-agency and cross-cutting actions that could support a more robust statewide response, also in reaction to the many heat-related fatalities that were recorded in 2023. So that kind of wraps up the 5 main buckets of recommendations put forth in our report. We also had a fairly long list of comprehensive state energy office programs documented within our appendices that did a deeper dive on Arizona, California, Colorado, Massachusetts, New York, and Oregon for having a lot of interesting program approaches already in place. The kind of layout of all of these or these state energy office profiles dive into the state context, which include exploring existing state energy plans, anything related to the implications of a more efficient and a heat-resistant building stock, which includes grid resilience. And then we also kind of capture across some of these states any particular definitions of low income to kind of highlight how these states go about determining program eligibility and prioritization criteria. Then we also do a rundown of any existing state programs in the form of financial incentives or funding streams, consumer education, workforce development, programs being piloted for wider deployment. We highlight any research and development currently being funded at the state level, which includes clean energy, technology demonstration and deployment. We found this important as a lot of these initial state investments could also generate replicable approaches for states that might not have that capacity or initial investment funding resource to then go out and also kind of demonstrate and test these solutions within their own states. And as well as program funding sources in any states that was easily tracked. This took the form of annual state budget carve-outs, ratepayer funded programs, and legislatively authorized spending, since it's pretty important to kind of contextualize for any other states looking to implement similar approaches about the resources required to go about it. All right, well, so that was a preview of the report. Obviously, it's a lot of information that we're excited to release in written format. And so anybody interested in reading it for themselves, hearing more, learning more, are absolutely welcome to reach out, and we'll be happy to disseminate that resource once it's published and live. But I think that's all for me.
Great, thank you, Jasmine. Yeah, and as Jasmine mentioned, this is a report that is forthcoming in the next month or so, and we hope to be able to spread that out and get folks the information from it. Does anybody on the call have any questions for either of our speakers, either on the report that Jasmine was just talking about, or kind of on the greater picture, or any of the cooling situation that we have right now? You're welcome to either unmute or raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi, Cass.
Sandy.
This is Sandy Fazeli at NASIO. Thank you both so much, Mark and Jasmine, for the presentations. Mark had mentioned that there isn't enough resources in LIHEAP to handle sort of the increased need for cooling assistance. And are there any studies that you know of what the number might be, like kind of modeling in climate impacts or increased demand? Or is that maybe an area that could warrant some more research?
I'm not sure if Mark's able to answer that, but I can give a quick stab at that. No, we don't have any kind of modeled number of what that need will be. I mean, frankly, we're not meeting the need in the winter either right now. So we don't know exactly what it would look like if we had what a fully funded program might look like. We have estimated in the past that something like $10 billion annually for LIHEAP would be sufficient to meet both the heating and the cooling needs. We do have a little bit of an example, because last year and over the past few years, there has been additional funding for the program. And last year in particular, there was $6 billion. And we did see a bunch of states expanding, choosing to do with those funds to expand a cooling program and to make funds accessible year round. And now that we're back down to 4, they're closing those down, and they're not going to be offering that this year. So while we don't know exactly what a perfect number would be, we do have an example just in recent past of what it could look like.
Got it. Thanks, Cass.
Sure. All right. While other folks are maybe thinking of questions that they have, I did want to kind of take a quick step back and give a little bit of context for the webinar series and what we're trying to do here. So this was a project that was started with the ClimateWorks Foundation and the Center for Energy Poverty and Climate, and NASIO is one of our close partners. And what we realized was that there were, as Mark was saying kind of at the top of the call, there were really good protections in the winter for shut off and arrearages and things like that, but in the summer there weren't as good protections. And so we started at saying, all right, well, we need to expand summer shut-off protections. And then we realized that, okay, so if we're not shutting people off in the winter and we're not shutting people off in the summer, then we've only got about 3 months of the year that we're shutting people off. So what we're doing, it essentially is turning low-income households into a twice-a-year energy bill payment system, because when you prevent shut-off, you're not eliminating the bill. And so we realize that what really needs to happen is just an overhaul of the entire system. We need to be making sure that low-income households are able to afford their energy, and that we're making sure their houses are efficient, and kind of top to bottom putting all the steps in place to make sure that low-income households in particular can adapt to rising temperatures, and we don't end up in crisis situations in the summer like we have seen in the winter in the past. So it's an issue that we kind of can see coming down the road. And as we kind of alluded to with the funding question, it is bigger than any one program. Extreme heat affects, it touches Medicaid and Medicare, it touches FEMA, it touches the energy offices, it touches housing. There's so much involved in this, and we really all have to kind of break down our silos and come together and see what pieces we can add to it in order to address the issue holistically. And I think that this report that Nazio just presented Jasmine just presented is an excellent kind of example of what this role of the State Energy Office is in that larger piece. All right. A little bit of a quiet group, but that's all right. I think then we'll probably end just a little bit early. So thank you very much. Jasmine, actually, or Mark, do you have any kind of final words to wrap us up?
No, I think that was really great context, Cass, just to kind of tie both Mark and my remarks together. And like Cass said, there are many more discussions to be had in the form of this 4-part webinar series and in the future. So to the extent that any states on the line or any other folks with interest in the topic are just getting started and they're thinking about equitable cooling or have any ideas to pitch in, there will definitely be future forums.
All right, thank you. And as Lena put in the chat, we will have the recording available and the slides available on the CEPC website, which is energyprograms.org. All right. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much to our speakers, Jasmine and Mark, for walking us through your research.